Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Days Zero podcast. I'm Spectre, with me is Z. And in this episode, we're going to be doing our summer recap. I know we are a little bit late on that. Usually we do that the first episode that we're back, but we were experimenting a little bit with the format. And, I guess summer did end a week or two ago. So I guess we're not too late on it. But
Yeah, I
we're going to
mean,
be talking about some of the stuff that we found interesting over the summer.
summer is done, but we're a little bit lazy getting to it. Already got our 3 episodes in. Just getting ahead our a running start on the summer recap, I guess.
Yeah, we're going to cover a few of the topics that we found interesting over the summer, as well as a new conference that started up, which had some very good talks. But we'll start out with some vulnerabilities that were kind of interesting and write ups. And actually, sorry, I totally forgot. We actually have our own thing to shout out first. Z did a follow up post on getting started with exploit development, so I'll let him talk about that.
Yeah, well, not so much a follow up, but like an update. So prior getting started post, I did quite a while back. I've looked at the actual time I did that. Yeah, back in 2021. It looks like I did a getting started. And I had a little bit of an update made to that where I dropped the old open security training exploit development course. Just, it's had some bit rot and moved more towards recommending Pwn College for a lot of content, although that kind of changes the order of everything because Pwn College doesn't cover a lot of stuff. Like, it's a very stack oriented thing, whereas open security training is a lot more varied in terms of what it covers. Like, you got format string, you got write what where, and you got more exposure to other things, but then you didn't deal with like mitigations, whereas Pwn College starts you right off with like ASLR and stuff. So yeah, I tried to find things that were relatively like easy to get going, like today, to compile the binaries if you need to or run it. Pwn College, of course, has a very nice environment to work with. Kind of changed the ordering a little bit. I did also add in, so obviously I've called out Pwn College, and of course, right as I did this with Pwn College, they've actually stopped linking their courses in the same way. So I linked to like a specific 2023 version of the course. Um, and it's not even loading right now. So now I'm worried they've actually dropped my link and I've already got Bitrot here. Genuinely looks like that's what happened. I've already got Bitrot when I just updated this to try and avoid Bitrot. Oh no, there we
Of
go. Just
course.
very slow. That page took a while to load. Like, I linked specifically to the fall 2023 class of like CSC 466 here, which they kind of stopped linking those out and they just have the most recent things there, or the ongoing ones. So like the current one there. So I don't know if they're going to kill off the link that I use, which would kind of suck because Kate, I went through the courses to take a look. And just a shout out, actually, kind of unrelated, but they are running their applied vulnerability research course again. That's 598. 598 is like their catch-all seminar sort of topic. Like, it changes every year. It's not always vulnerability related, but this year it's their vulnerability research course, which is actually going for trying to hunt for bugs and such. I believe they talked about this. I talked about it a little bit during the summer. Actually, I forgot to add it to the episode, but honestly, probably should, because their focus here is on. I'm actually going to pull it up in Discord really quickly because I found the syllabus for the course and looked like they were going to be covering XNU. Yeah, here we go. Fall 2024, the whole class will be focused on Apple's XNU operating system, which is the core OS kernel that runs Mac OS, iOS, iPad OS. Through demanding hands-on modules we host on the Pwn College platform, we'll study the XNU kernel, several vulnerability classes in XNU, and how exploitation works in XNU, and historical vulnerabilities and exploit techniques. To be able to identify and exploit vulnerabilities in the XNU kernel. So sounds like it's going to be a cool course. I haven't taken a look at it yet. I honestly forgot about it until I was just clicking here on Pwn College about this, but looks like an interesting course and probably going to be worth checking out. Last time I think
That
they
is
ran
cool.
this.
There is like an unfortunate lack of resources when it comes to Apple research. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, there is a lack there. I was kind of expecting them to actually do this in x86. Like, my thought was that's how they kind of deal with something, because XNU is open source, so you can build part of it and deal with that. But looking here, it looks like they've got the like introduction to ARM 64 ROP, so they're jumping right into it with ARM, so that's also a plus to have it a bit more realistic and such. Because my suspicion was that they might not do that, but obviously they're going for it. Sounds like a really cool course. I think the last time they ran 598, it was like had vulnerability research where they were able to hunt on a variety of targets and focus more on the hunting aspects. This is a little bit different than the last time, but yeah, worth checking out. And now jumping back to the actual update that I have here, which is they're getting started. I still put a focus on trying to get, so I use Pwn College as like a very core part of this. It's where most of the exploitation learning happens. I do add in open security trainings vulnerabilities 1001. There's also a 1002 course which I didn't include. I would include it like if you're going towards like real world exploitation, but I kind of left it as just the 1001 course here as recommendation, just to kind of get that exposure to other types of things, because Pwn College's core course, that 466, is really just stack-based buffer overflows all the time. At least as far as the exercise go. At one point, they do talk about some other types of issues, but I don't think any of the challenges actually incorporate. Okay, I guess there are some, when you go into the kernel, they have a couple other things. Like, there are a few aspects, but the course does not have the same breadth as the other course I used to recommend did, but this is far easier. So yeah, I've kind of gone through, updated things, updated links to try and pull things together in a cohesive way that still kind of give you a lot of exposure, even including a little bit about Windows and transitioning between Linux and Windows, because so many people complain like, oh, well, I want to do Windows exploitation, therefore what I learn on Linux doesn't matter, and that just isn't true. This, and now Pwn College actually has a little module that's actually about the transition, how similar things are. Like, there are differences, but fundamentally software is software. Memory doesn't like change how it works on Windows because it's Windows. Like, you've got the same deal going on. But yeah, I kind of gave that a whole overhaul rather than just trying to update the old one. So wanted to shout that out. I did that over the summer. And something to check out if you're, well, I imagine a lot of people listening probably already know a lot of the content, so maybe not for yourself, but hopefully, you'd agree with it and share it with others, or suggest
something maybe you can recommend.
Yeah, or suggest some things to change on it. I'm always open to kind of talking about it and considering what I recommend, because I'm not a fan of just like, oh, you should learn the way I learned a topic, because things improve. We have better resources than I did. And different things are more important now than they were like 20 years ago. Like, there's very little on this about shell coding, for example. Like, I don't think you need to learn about Venetian shell code today.
Yeah, the example I was going to give was with x86. Like, if you follow the classic like ways to learn x86, you'll learn about like segmentation and all that kind of stuff. And it's like, I don't really think you need to know that for the most part today.
Yeah,
it's just not really relevant.
It's still there a little bit in kernel exploitation. No use segment registers, but
a tiny bit.
Yeah, like it's not very much. Like, it's not a hard thing to learn. But actually, on that note, like the very classic SEH overflows, like if you go and you want to learn Windows exploitation, it's like, oh yeah, and then this thing, and it's like, like this is basically your return address overflow with a slightly different flavor, and even at that, 32-bit Windows only. Like, oh yeah, there's a lot that changes. Like, yeah, so I've tried to keep this. Here's where I think somebody should go if they want to get into modern exploitation. Not just recommending what's worked for me, but I want to know what other people think. So definitely feel free to share your own recommendations, or where you think I'm just going crazy and definitely shouldn't be recommending something. I'd appreciate hearing any feedback on that.
I will say, obviously, this post and our discussion here has been focused on exploit development at low level specifically. It might be a good idea to make a similar post like this for web, because web has kind of experienced a similar evolution where you look at a lot of the issues that you would learn about from like the early 2000s and whatever, and you have like your straightforward SQLIs and stuff like that. And those kinds of issues are pretty antiquated at this point. So
there's
like
the answer to that. Portswigger's Web Security Academy.
Yeah, I mean, fair
That's
enough. We always shout out like Portswigger's Security Academy, but I'm just saying like a post maybe aggregating some more beyond that might be nice.
yeah, something that maybe touches more on the. So the thing about what the Web Security Academy, I love it, but it's not a replacement really for the old Web Application Hackers Handbook book. Like it is a really awesome resource for here are all these different attacks. You know, here's clickjacking. I've just got the thing up here. Here's LLM stuff. You know, they keep it updated. Here's GraphQL. And like really focus on the exploits and the attacks, and not so much on the hunting. And I think that is some, and I guess that's true actually even with my resource here. It is very focused on the exploitation, not so much on actually finding them. So that's kind of lacking. But when it comes to something equivalent for web, honestly, like Portswigger is like the recommendation I'd have to just put out there. Like they cover pretty much anything you're going to want. And like I said, they
Yeah,
keep this stuff updated.
fair enough.
Apart from not covering the hunting aspect super well, they cover all the topics that they do cover very well, and on the attacks. Like,
Yeah, fair enough.
if you gave me a bit more time, I'd probably come with a few other recommendations on the website because I know there are some other links I usually share, but they're not coming to me right now.
Yeah, no worries. It just kind of occurred to me while you were talking about it, like the fact that we have some of these posts for exploit development, but not on the website. So might be something we could do.
Yeah, my feeling
Um,
is like on the website, Portswigger has like very much become the de facto recommendation. It's constantly updated, so like I don't take issue with that. But on the binary side for the low level exploitation, there are still people going around recommending like hacking artifact exploitation. Like, yeah, you need to read this book.
yeah,
And it was a great book at its time. And like, you know, I don't know, people rely on the idea, oh, well, you know, you still learn something, therefore it still has value. And it's like, I just don't like that argument. We had our discussion about like old books and recommending them, during which like you legitimately changed my mind on recommending like artifact exploitation in particular. Because I just got a feeling like, you know, there's most of this book is no longer relevant. There's this one really, really good bit that introduces you, and then like nothing else is really what you need to be focused on. And it's just like, um,
it kind of comes down to the efficiency of learning, I guess. And it feels like often the recommendations and exploit developments specifically seem to be like, very dated and not efficient anymore.
yeah,
So
that's kind of the problem I've had is like a lot of these things I think are people trying to pretend like they know exploit development. And so they've heard hacking artifact exploitation has been recommended by somebody I really trust who really knows this. Therefore, I'm going to recommend and pretend like I know what I'm talking about. And I feel like that's why it gets recommended a lot, is because it has that reputation. And it just gets, especially like I see that book recommended. It's like, oh, you want to be a network pen tester? Read Hacking Artifact Exploitation. And it's like,
yeah.
that's not taking you far enough to matter here at all. So yeah, that's why I've put the focus on putting out like this sort of getting started with binary level, because I feel like there's just so much kind of crap that gets recommended. And again, it's not like Hacking Artifact Exploitation was a bad book, but as you said, kind of learning efficiency. Like there are better resources you could use to get to where you need to be today, rather than just being like, well, there's some value out of this. There is some none, because there is. Like there's value in that book. It's just not a ton in the grand scheme of things, and they're just better resources that are easier to use and do a better job today.
So getting into some topics by other people, there were a few posts that we found interesting over the summer. The first of which was a Lua RCE based in Factorio. So, as people who know me probably know, Factorio is a game that I really love to play. So that probably played a part in why I like this post. But it talks about Lua being used, which is a fairly common language in games. So a lot of this is probably applicable outside of Factorio, just to other games that use Lua in general. I won't go into all the specifics of it, But a lot of it is talking about basically how you can exploit malicious Lua bytecode, or being able to change the bytecode in like precompiled scripts, and using that to gain memory corruption primitives. So they focus on first getting like an info leak by messing with key values and creating like a fake string. And then they also talk about using closures and such for getting code execution. So yeah, it's a really cool post. I would recommend people check it out, especially if like Lua is something that's common in targets you want to look at, or if like you like Lua. It's sort of got the same vibe as browser exploitation. A lot of it is very similar. You're getting around, you're exploiting the language engine and trying to get primitives inside of the language. So if you're like me, you probably really enjoy that style of exploitation and think it's really cool. So yeah, I really
Yeah,
like this post, and I figured I'd give it a shout.
Lua definitely has some interesting use case, because it is there as like that scripting language, kind of like in browsers you've got JavaScript. For a lot of things, especially in games, Lua is common, but it is just one of those default kind of embeddable scripting languages. So you will see it actually sometimes in, not super often, but I have seen it on like embedded stuff too, where they want to have the benefit of being able to like script something instead of always need to compile. But yeah, it's an interesting kind of situation, or an interesting area to do exploitation. Like you said, kind of that language focus and the focus on. Um, I guess it's an interesting attack surface, because on one hand you do have a lot of control with like a language, like calling in there. So I don't know, it's an interesting dynamic for exploitation. I've played around with it only a little bit, and that was years
Lua in
ago.
particular is very interesting because we made that comparison to browsers. And obviously, like as we've covered on the podcast, browser security issues with being able to go from JavaScript to native code execution and getting like arbitrary read write and things is considered a strong security boundary. And like there's a lot of effort that goes into mitigating those exploits from happening, and also doing like heap isolation to try to make it harder to get those primitives. With Lua, though, the blog post actually points out that so Lua had a bytecode verifier to try to make it so that if you had malicious bytecode, or if the bytecode got corrupted or something, there was another layer of defense so that you couldn't just like cause type confusions and stuff very easily, because that is the basis of what they're doing here for the most part, is causing type confusions. And it's the same in browser, like that is the meta game basically. But in Lua's case, they actually their bytecode verifier was so like easy to bypass, and there were so many bypasses for it, that they actually stopped shipping it. Actually, like they don't even use it anymore. I think it was in Lua 5.1 that they stopped. Oh, maybe not.
I've
I'm
got
just trying to find the
5.2
version.
here. It
Yeah, it
says
might have been
Mentos
5.2.
removed 5.2 as it was repeatedly found to be bypassable.
Yeah. So you again kind of have that situation that PHP often finds itself in, where, if you have the PHP code execution, you can go to memory corruption with a fair amount of bugs, and it's not really treated as a security boundary by the PHP developers, so it's really weird. But in Lua, it's even more applicable, because generally being able to run like arbitrary PHP is a fairly high bar. Like usually PHP is running on the server, so it's not easy to get that code execution. But where Lua is typically run on clients, being able to run like malicious Lua and mess with the bytecode there is a lot more reasonable as an attacker. So it's in a very interesting position, and it's a difficult problem to mitigate. So this post probably has a lot of useful information just for exploiting Lua in general for memory corruption.
Yeah, although I will say, like, the thing is, it runs on the client, as you mentioned, and that client, like, it's not like you're getting a privilege escalation out of that. Like in a lot of cases,
Generally not.
you're already kind of the user who's running the code. So like, what what access you're really gaining out of exploiting it does kind of vary. Like there are situations where Lua is used and can be a security boundary, but kind of like with PHP, um, if you're already able to run like arbitrary PHP code, you're probably able to run arbitrary code. Like there's a safe mode that's technically the one thing that PHP has the security boundary, but then they don't care when you bypass it anyhow because yeah, they just don't care. And yeah, Lua's kind of in that situation where um there's maybe a bit more of a clear security boundary, like it's running on the client and kind of untrusted, but it's also the client attacking themselves in those cases, for a lot of games and such. But it's used very widely. Like Lua has been around forever and gets used quite widely. That there definitely are cases where it could be used, and they do talk about here, getting remote code execution. So like it's not all just local and client on like attacking themselves.
Yeah, so this is something that I probably should have mentioned earlier, but part of why they had the focus on Factorio here and why it's useful there is they mentioned that Factorio has like tick to tick synchronization. So if one person like connected to the server runs Lua code, then all the other clients have to run that code as well in order to remain synchronized. So that's where that RCE aspect comes up. It makes it pretty interesting. Is now, to be fair, in order to leverage this, you would need to have a degree of privileges. Like they mentioned, either being able to use the C command, which you would need permission for, or creating a custom map or mod, which again, you would need privileges on the server. But anyone else that connects to that server would be able to be exploited. Similar to other game bugs we've covered, like with CSGO and Workshop map style attacks. It's not unreasonable. It very well could happen. Even Factorio, like they have an in-game server browser, which they mention. So yeah, that's kind of the threat model, so to speak, in this instance. And with games in general, like that is the way you're gonna go. And as I've said before, you know, Lua is pretty common in the games for some of that higher level scripting and especially like UI stuff and whatnot. It's used a lot.
Yeah.
If you could use it for RCE in this way in a lot of games, I'm not sure. I'm not familiar enough with game dev, but it wouldn't surprise me if a lot of other games work the same way like this, where Lua commands and code would be shared amongst those connected to a server.
Yeah, I feel like in a lot of games, you're not really going to have code that can come. Like I guess a lot of games don't necessarily let you run a server like that. Like there are some games that do, but there's also a good number of games, I'd probably say even the majority, where the server is a bit more tightly locked down. I didn't even realize Factorio was a multiplayer game or had servers. Like I know very little about Factorio. I know you play it and like I've seen pictures of the game, but I don't really didn't really know much about it. I guess it makes sense that there is the multiplayer aspect, but yeah, like it's a lot of things that use Lua would probably have pretty fixed scripts when it comes to what's actually being executed, and like the ability to provide anything or like do the custom maps is there in a good chunk of games, but it's not there in probably more games.
Yeah. I will say with Factorio, like there is a multiplayer aspect to it, but it's mostly like it's sort of the same as Minecraft, where it's like typically you're only going to be like hosting a server for you and like your friends to play on or something like that. You don't really have it's not really like CS where in Counter-Strike like you have like server browsers and community servers where you have a bunch of random people connecting to it. That's not really happening very much in Factorio. So that is like a bit of a distinction I wanted to make there. And I don't fault you for not knowing it's a multiplayer game. A lot of people do play it solo. But you can play it with others and you're not generally like PvPing in it as much as you're like collaborating. So
Yeah, fair enough. Like I say, it kind of makes sense. Like it is that sort of hill crafting sort of game, I guess. Like it's not it. Okay, I don't know if this comparison will make sense because again, I haven't actually played the game, but I almost want to say it's like a nerd Stardew Valley sort of thing where you're maybe not quite building a farm, but like maybe that sort of vibe in terms of the gameplay. I don't know. I
I
might
think
be
that would be a
totally
fair
off.
comparison. But yeah, so that was the post that I found interesting. Z, I know there was one you found interesting from Ambionic Security, so I'll let you get into that one.
Yeah, and that was this Iconv, and they've actually got 3 posts here about this issue, and with those 3 posts, the latest one actually just came out like a week ago or so. It was at the end of September when the latest one came out. But yeah, this Iconv or Iconv, however you're supposed to say it. It's a conversion thing. I remember, so one, when this was first announced as it was going to be talked about at a conference, it definitely got picked up by a lot of people as like this major bug or potentially major bug. We didn't have any details on it. Because I remember like people that I know that aren't in security but do some development and like do some web dev were asking me about it and were talking about this bug, not necessarily knowing the details. So like it had some exposure out there. Turns out like it's definitely got impact. It is kind of a alternative exploitation strategy rather than necessarily a whole standalone thing. In that this is about converting file read primitives into remote code execution. So definitely has its impact. No doubt there. It is kind of a place where they talk about using PHAR, PHAR, the PHP archive file format as like another way people use to get code execution from file reads. That hasn't worked with PHP 8, I believe, and like, of course, a lot of people just disable PHP archives because not many people actually would use those. So there, it had its impact or it's had its place even when those other things still existed. And this is better than like your LFI to RC, which has of course exists for a long time, but local file inclusion is like actually including. PHP lets you include to be run as code. Whereas this is just file read. So like file underscore get underscore contents, where you can control what's being read. You'd be able to turn that into a full code execution inside of the PHP engine. And that has to do with this Iconv function, where well, first of all, it has to do with PHP filters. PHP filters are like a big exploit playground where they have one example here, but I actually want to show something else first. Yeah, let's start with the basics for PHP filters. Are kind of an interesting feature in PHP specifically, where you can open this kind of file here, and PHP supports a lot of different types of files, and uh or when I say types of files, I mean like the starting where you've got PHP : / like you could do a zip file, you give it like a zip location, then file inside the zip and have it open that and read it. You can give it again the PHP archive. You can give it like in this example, they're using a filter to do a base 64 encode. So you're basically saying like, yeah, read this file and encode it as base 64. You can do a decode, so you could read like a base 64 encoded file. It is a really cool feature of PHP because you just get like your file descriptor here. And with that file descriptor, like anything that takes a file descriptor can just read this, and it doesn't even know it's actually reading inside of a zip or this is base 64. And with these filters, like with the base 64 encode here, you can combine this with Iconv, which is where they found this buffer overflow in it. Or, yeah, I guess kind of buffer overflow. Hey, I was saying about how you classify it. Yeah, it's 3 byte. I'll get into that briefly, but you can also see an example here where they do a lot of conversions, like chain a ton of filters in here in order to actually prepend a little bit of text. And that ties in with an older post that we talked about briefly. I don't think we covered this one in detail because it is a very difficult bug to kind of follow, but using filter chains to create this arbitrary file read. Cool write up from Synactive. It's kind of a CTF thing, but I feel like I still talked about doing this because it is a really cool chain. Explains how this whole thing works, like inject content with these filters. But anyway, with these filters, if you can get a file read where you can provide like PHP filter and like control what's being read here, you can get to do this Iconv, which is used to convert between one character set to another. And specifically, it's with the CN well ISO 2022 CN ext character set. There might be a buffer overflow with that one specifically. So if you have your file read, you can give it, and you can get it to open an arbitrary file. You can then use this filter and do an iConvert using this, or converting something into this CN-ext character set. you might be able to get an overflow. And I really like this code example. Like, this is kind of like, unfortunately, they have comments in here that are going to make it really obvious where the issue is. But I did want to shout out kind of this code sample as like something to keep your eye out for if you're actually like reading code looking for overflows. I believe they might have said they found this with fuzzing though. Or I know they talk about fuzzing, maybe they did find it, but anyway, the code they've got here with this character set, the way it ends up working, it actually supports like multiple character sets inside of it, and it will output an escape sequence when it needs like to specify basically what the actual encoding being used is. And you have kind of these three options here. We've got if, else if, matches this other mask or whatever, and then else if on a third mask. And these three blocks of code have very similar code. Like they have, here's character to the escape sequence. They set with the escape sequence. Then they do the output pointer as they write it. And they do that on this one too. And they do that on the other one. Like they all kind of follow that same pattern, except one of them deviates. One of them has a bounce check. And the other two don't. And that's sort of a thing that should be a code smell if you're reading code. Is to go like, okay, why does this one deviate? When the code is otherwise the same, why is one of these doing something different? Maybe there's a good reason for it. In this case, it's just they didn't bounce check on those other two. And so if you convert it and provide characters that will fall into one of those other two, these will go ahead and write the characters, the necessary characters, basically out of bounds because it doesn't bother checking the bounds before adding them. Leading to a 1 to 3 byte overflow. Just because it doesn't check if the buffer is big enough to fit it. And they kind of show what values would be written because this is a overflow, but not with fixed values. And the rest of the post goes into like the exploitation, some of the PHP internals and all of that. And interestingly, some of the places where this didn't work, like they found libxml2 and trying to find like, okay, they've got this Iconv bug, which is just in glibc. So widely used, but you need kind of these preconditions. I thought it was kind of funny. libxml2 wasn't the funny one, but I'll mention the way they did the processing is you can give it input in any character set. It'll just convert to UTF-8, do its work, and then convert back to whatever the original character set was. But it would do so for the output buffer. It would allocate it 4 times bigger than the input. Which they just couldn't overflow then. But I really like the PK exec case, which just kind of sucks for the researcher here. Because PK exec would allocate however many bytes plus 4. And this was a 3 byte overflow. So
that's tough.
Just like I don't know like why they did the plus 4 or like what's going on with that choice there. But the fact that it was just like, a 3 byte overflow and they do it by 4. Like they just do that for just has to suck for them. And yeah, the rest of it goes into some of the exploitation.
It feels bad when like really hacky, just quick mitigations like that, because I think why they did that is they're like, oh, we don't want to have to deal with off by 1 type issues or whatever, so just make it slightly bigger than we think it needs to be. And it's like, it's fair. It is like somewhat of a mitigation, but it's really lazy. So it feels really bad when that defeats you as an attacker.
Yeah, it kind of sucked there. They did ultimately, like they were able to find cases where this could be exploitable. But yeah, I thought that was kind of fun. And when they come to the exploitation, it seems like there are 3 posts. Like I said, one just came out pretty recently. They start off here where, they're able to like, because you've got an arbitrary file rate, like you could just read proc self maps, get like the memory maps and like get a lot of information that way. So they're not dealing with a lot of mitigations here. PHP isn't super hardened against like these internal corruptions, but they do go into some of the heap aspects, how things get allocated, how some of the, I think they use the chunk filter here, go into some of the internals, which I'm not going to run through, and then they do like illustrate this with a WordPress thing where, because it's on PHP 8.3.x, this is one that you won't be able to do the FAR, or the PHP archive attacks, but you could do it with this PHP, they have this Buddy Forms plugin where they have their file reads, and now they're able to use this bug to exploit it. you do depend on having that file read, but file read to RC is a pretty big jump in terms of impact. So yeah, definitely a cool bug and a cool set of bugs that they go into. I'll be honest, I haven't read the other two parts yet. This was the one I saw during the summer, so at least wanted to call that out as we're checking out. And yeah, like it seems like a good write-up. A lot of kind of details there in terms of the PHP internals, which we're kind of just talking about the language sort of attacks and stuff. Like PHP is a bit of an interesting situation because they have like this PHP safe mode which can be turned on, which exists, but then they don't care about as like a security boundary. So some of these sort of bugs where it is like remote code execution is kind of cool to see, because a lot of PHP engine bugs end up just being like you need the ability to run arbitrary PHP code. Yeah, I'll just leave it at that. I thought this had some cool aspects to it.
So during the summer, a Phrack issue was published. It was a little bit interesting because they did sort of a thing with DEF CON where at DEF CON they actually had an early physical release. So they had physical issues of Phrack actually that you could get if you went to DEF CON, which I thought was a bit neat. But it was published online on the 19th of August. And, as per usual, when Phrack issues come out, they're not super common or anything. So, it's noteworthy. And
yeah, I was thinking this one came out quickly and it was still like 3 years since the last issue.
Dude, the last couple of years have flown by so fast, it's hard to even keep track of time anymore.
Yeah,
linear time doesn't make sense.
It was faster than 69 to 70. 69 happened in 2016 or 15.
I think it was 2016. Yeah,
2016, and then they had 2021, and now a 2024 release. So slowly getting faster.
Yeah. So, wanted to shout it out. I was a little bit let down by this Phrack issue, I will say. I felt like there wasn't as many interesting articles, at least interesting to me, in this issue as there had been in some previous issues. But there is still probably something in there for a majority of our audience, at least, one or two things. One that you said you found interesting, Z, was the bypassing ZET one. I think we talked about that a little bit in Discord, right?
Yeah, I brought it up in Discord when I first saw that there was like the new Phrack issue. I'm like, oh, somebody's talking about this. Functional oriented programming. It's kind of a take on like COP. With more folks, COP itself is doing call oriented, which don't see in a lot of exploits. You're usually just want to see jump oriented, not so much call. But the whole idea of just using like whole functions as your gadgets. Functional oriented programming, I think somebody did kind of play it off as like being returned to libc, but it's different from that in the sense of like this is like a more generic sort of thing. You're closer to ROP where you're dealing with gadgets and chains and like the side effects and not just like calling system. It's not as easy as that, but I don't think I've actually seen anybody talking about functional oriented programming. Like we've talked about like the idea of using whole function gadgets and kind of that idea, but functional orienting proper, which, there's a paper, I think 2018 paper about it, but that paper's kind of paywalled off. I had access to it through my university. I tried sharing it. I'm like, oh, actually, this is all like, there's all my information about my school and stuff too. And sharing that PDF, so I retracted that share of it. But yeah, this is the first time I've seen any write-up kind of explicitly calling it out, so I found that kind of interesting. The whole thing, like, if you understand ROP, you understand, like, Jaw, you're not going to have any issue. Like, functional-oriented programming, it's not, like, some crazy groundbreaking idea. It's just with CET and branch target identifier, like you are limited in where you can call, therefore you need to start using whole functions as your target. So BTI is the thing that adds the end BR and branch instruction to say like all your branch targets need to go here. That's all that's going on with that, which limits what you can do. So like it's nothing crazy. It's just the first time I've seen this specific thing kind of being talked about outside of that paper, but the concept has existed elsewhere for sure.
And for what it's worth, when you were talking about our Discord conversation earlier and said that someone had compared it to rectalibc, that was me.
Oh, I just remembered it kind of came up with rectalibc, and like there's a fairness to that because it is calling the whole functions. It's just the focus is a bit more genericized.
Yeah. So there's that one. Another one that people may find interesting is a novel page UAF exploit strategy for like Linux. I think this has been covered a fair bit by like Project Zero. I think has done some write-ups about it and actually trying to mitigate that sort of thing. But still, it does kind of lay it out. And the nice thing with Phrack issues is where they're meant to be succinct and you have like the ASCII only art and stuff like that, they can be very nice for getting a rundown of techniques, even if it's not necessarily like novel or new. They're generally good for getting a quick idea of what's going on and doesn't have like a lot of filler to it. So that can be very nice. So yeah, I mean, I'm sure a lot of the people listening probably knew that the Phrack issue came out and have already checked it out. But for those that weren't aware or whatever, definitely do check it out and then see if some of the articles there catch your fancy.
Yeah, and I just want to shout out one. This is just kind of a random fact that I found interesting out of one of these. I also read this allocating new exploits post, and the idea there, the subtitle here is "Poning browsers like kernel," and just draws in some ideas. So in the kernel, in Linux kernel exploitation, you've got the slab allocator, so you've got that style of allocator going on, and partition alloc in the Blink engine follows a similar has a similar structure, and so they kind of talk about that. They relate kind of this Chrome bug to a kernel bug, and so I found that kind of accessible to me, somebody who doesn't do a lot of browser exploitation but have done plenty of the kernel exploitation. Found it kind of accessible to read through this, although it isn't like a JIT bug or something. This is just with the BMP parsing thing, so yeah, it's not quite so interested there. They did have a fairly limited primitive, but just kind of the one kind of side fact that they called out here that I found interesting was like, oh, huh, interesting idea, is the way the partition alloc tries to prevent linear overflows from being able to mess with the free list. So they don't store most of the data, like metadata for the heap, because they are trying to be more hardened heap, of course, in the browser. They'll store their metadata often its own like page, often its own section. They'll have guard pages around it, so you can't like overflow into it. And that way all the metadata is kind of safe from being corrupted. The exception to that is the free list. And the free list, I just thought it was interesting that they made the choice that they store the free list pointer. So it is stored inline, but they do it in big endian. So free a block or free a chunk, it puts the pointer to the next free entry as like the first thing. That's kind of like a lot of allocators kind of go that route. When something's free, they reuse that data just to make it easy to have a list and make it very efficient. I just thought it was interesting that it's like, yeah, they use big endian. That way, if you overflow into it, you can't do a partial overwrite. You have to either overwrite the whole thing with like a big endian value instead of little endian. Of course, we're talking about this from the little endian aspect there. I don't know. I just thought that was kind of interesting way of preventing the partial overwrite attack on it. Just like, oh yeah,
it's a clever, basically zero cost mitigation. So that's cool.
Yeah, so I kind of wanted to shout that out. Overall post, like I said, I kind of was able to relate to it more, but it also isn't really the classic browser exploit that I wouldn't relate to. So there's that, but I thought that was kind of a fun fact that I didn't know about partition alloc.
Yeah. So getting into our last thing that was interesting over the summer, there was a new conference that was started up. So this was Off by OneCon that was hosted in Singapore. It's ran by Star Labs, which if you've heard their name before, it's probably because they do tons of stuff with like Pwn2Own, for example.
Yeah, and we cover them from time to time. It's like starlabs.fg, I think.
Yeah, we covered some of their posts and research.
They have a good blog.
Yeah. I will say, like, this is their first year doing the conference, but the talks they had were really good. They had a really good lineup. In particular, the keynote, Breaking into Vulnerability Research, was an awesome talk, and I would recommend to anyone who listens to us to check it out. It's just a very, like, inspirational talk, and it's not super technical. Like, it doesn't get into specific vulnerabilities or exploit development practices, but it talks about, like, frame of mind and methodology and stuff like that. So I really enjoyed that talk. There were a few other cool talks as well.
An important caveat on the talk you just mentioned about getting into vulnerability research, I feel like the title is slightly misleading, breaking into vuln research, because what it's talking about or where it's coming from the perspective on. So this is a Dr. Silvo Cesari. I'm not sure if I'm saying that correct, but like I definitely recognize the name. He's been around forever. Like not a new name to see around, but he's talking more about like the challenges of starting and running a vulnerability research company rather than
Or
like
team.
breaking into
But
or
yeah.
team, but like it's got that focus which I've never heard talked about before. And yeah, I found it really interesting. It does even touch on some things like his hiring, their interview kind of process or hiring process and stuff, which I mean for those who want to get into it could be interesting. But yeah, the focus isn't really, there is some about the engineering, like the research side of it, that I found valuable, like some really good insights there. But just in terms of what it is covering, like the focus is maybe a different perspective than you would expect, or at least I expected from the topic, but still, yeah, this was the one talk that I basically went like immediate to watch, was to get through this one. Yeah, found it really good.
Yeah, and even if you're not looking to like start a VR shop or like start a team or whatever, like there's a lot of takeaways, whichever side of the aisle you are interested in or work on. There's a lot of things you can take away from it. There's also a few other talks that are pretty interesting. GPU AF using a general GPU exploit tech to attack Pixel 8. That I think has some overlap with some stuff we've covered on the show before, but even still, presentations are really nice to be able to digest stuff and have the slides and everything to go off of. Another one that I think you had found interesting, Z, was the universal code execution.
Yeah, I mean that one caught my eye because I recognized that it was Space Raccoon. Given that one, we it's one of our most covered blogs like on the podcast. So yeah, seeing that he had one here, like the whole focus of this conference, he kind of mentioned this actually at the start of their talk. It's like he's the, I don't think he uses this term, but like the token web talk, because they're very focused on like O days. And then it's like, here's this one in the browser. But what I thought was interesting with this one was the research process in this case. Like it covers kind of, there's a lot of background and just understanding over how browser extensions work, but the scope of what he was looking for. He basically just knew like there's got to be somebody messing up this process where they're allowing like these messages to be sent and they're insecurely handling them in like a native application. And so I think they end up scanning like 100,000 projects and coming up with like 31 that are potential vulnerability, like are places where there could be the potential for a vulnerability. I found that aspect kind of interesting, just like the scope. Use SemGraph to do a lot of the early analysis to get down to some limited subsets. So there are probably others that would have issues. Just kind of look for the trivial case, but I found that to be the interesting aspect. Yeah, just a lot of background here on how like the messaging works, which isn't necessarily a topic you can find anywhere else, but yeah, just something to be aware of, and getting basically code execution from, in theory, from any website, like going from any website to attacking like the extension that has a browser, or sorry, that has a native component, and getting code execution that way. So universal code execution. It's a cool concept. Ultimately, seem to find some issues there. So yeah, cool chain. I found that interesting. Yeah, it is a little bit of a different topic from the rest of it. Uh, but pretty much always some good research from Space Raccoon. So I was pleasantly surprised to see that he had a slot at this conference. And yeah, for their first year, I kind of have a similar sentiment as I did with Hexacon when we covered their first year. I have high hopes for the future. Like it looks like a solid conference. It's not massive, just 2 days, single track, uh, but some good talks.
Yeah, I will say it seems like they do have a bit of growing pains. Unfortunately, one talk that I did want to check out but found really difficult to follow was attacking the Samsung Galaxy A boot chain, because the slides, like the presentation, wasn't shown for some reason, and they didn't publish the slides for any of the talks on their site. So it's you just have the speaker in front of you, and that can be really tough to follow along without having any slides to go off. And the audio in some of the presentations, like even the keynote that I mentioned before, the audio can be a little bit difficult to listen to at times because you have like ambient noise and stuff going on. Hopefully that is something that is improved in the next iteration. But yeah, in terms of like purely like the talk quality and stuff, this conference seems awesome, so it will be definitely on my radar for future years.
Yeah, and I'll just kind of mention when it comes to audio quality, something that I do. Of course, I have this set up because we're doing the podcast here. But sometimes what I'll do with like poor audio quality and like where you have like a lot of background or like speaker buzz or something like that going on, is I'll actually I'll route like Chrome's audio through OBS, and then OBS has a filter you can apply that's like a noise noise removal, noise reduction thing, RNN noise. I'll actually run through that and then turn on OBS monitoring so I can hear what OBS sends out, and I'll get
Oh,
the
that's
audio
a that's
through
a
that
clever
way.
trick. I
And
don't think
it
you told me
will,
about that one.
yeah, I use that not super often. Like I don't listen to a lot of really poor things, but it does a really good job of cleaning up a lot of audio, especially with conference talks. I've done that a fair bit. Yeah, cleans it up quite well. And like I don't know if it's going to depend on your CPU or whatever in terms of that, but I haven't noticed any delay. So I'd still be watching it in Chrome, and like I wouldn't notice the difference, but I'd be routing all my audio through OBS first, and that has to do with my audio setup. Might not. I think they have something to do with like a capture of a specific application now, but I have a bit of a different setup. But yeah, that has worked for me, and it's made a lot of things a lot more listenable.
I might have to give that a try. I like that. But yeah, so that pretty much concludes everything that we found interesting over the summer and our summer recap.
I guess I'll mention that I feel like it was a good summer. I mean, we didn't get out the content that we wanted as usual when we left. We kind of talked about wanting to get some content out during the summer, and as usual, it didn't happen. But um,
Yeah, my summer was pretty chill. I didn't really do like a lot of conferences or anything. And, I was actually fine with that. Last year was a really hectic year for me. So I was okay with having a chill year of just, staying at home and working on stuff at home. That said, though, on the topic of conferences, I am going to be at Hardware IO Netherlands in like 2 weeks. So, uh, quiet summer, but not so quiet fall, I suppose.
has that
So,
been officially announced?
it is on their site. I don't think they've tweeted out about it, but
But
people have dug it up and found out. So
it's
yeah, I
known.
figure it's
Okay, yeah.
yeah.
So you're not the one breaking the news there. Fair
No.
enough. Yeah, you've got that in just a couple weeks, and you'll be talking about.
Uh, I'll be talking about some vulnerabilities and an exploit that we wrote, or actually two exploits that we wrote to break the PS5 hypervisor on lower firmwares. So, uh, I know a fair amount of people are looking forward to that talk, and it's kind of nice because it lets you look into the system more. Like, I don't want to talk too much about PS5 here, but PS5 does have execute only memory, which is might be the only device out there that has that for x86. Because that's something that was pioneered by ARM. But it basically means that even though you can execute code, that doesn't mean you can read it. Any data fetches to the instructions will cause a crash. So obviously, when you're trying to reverse engineer things and stuff, that's pretty annoying. So being able to break the hypervisor lets you turn off execute only memory basically on the kernel so that you can dump the kernel text and reverse it, which will be pretty nice for like public people who weren't able to get dumps from people before and whatnot.
Yeah, sounds cool. And execute only memory is one of those mitigations that, in a lot of cases, it isn't super impactful, but the console scene is one place where it definitely has a pretty substantial impact. Like it doesn't matter too much when you're able to get the actual binaries that you're running like on your computer, but
Yeah.
yeah, on the console you don't get that access. And they try and prevent that, so it makes sense that it's there. Yeah, I'm looking forward to hearing your talk.
Thank you. But yeah, that concludes pretty much everything. So as always, thanks goes out to everyone who tuned in, and we will see you next week.